frame rater.
We're getting into the home stretch of games I had always wanted to review but never really got around to. With the new Crash Bandicoot game getting a re-release on modern platforms, I figured it was a better time than ever to review the first Crash game I ever played, The Huge Adventure for the Game Boy Advance. It was also likely my first Game Boy Advance game. Starting off the game, you're introduced to a slideshow cutscene with some text on the bottom demonstrating the game's story. Cortex's mask Uka Uka is upset with him for failing him too many times. But as always, Cortex has another plan. This time he will use his latest invention, the Planetary Minimizer, to shrink planet Earth. This will force its inhabitants to bow to his superior intellect, including Crash, supposedly. Crash's mask friend Aku Aku tells Crash that with the power of the crystals, he could reverse the effects and bring the planet back to size. So ultimately, it's another Crash gets the crystals story. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. What is a bit disappointing is how the size of planet Earth doesn't change anything regarding the gameplay. I mean, it makes sense, the planet has shrunk and so too has everything within it. But the game's title and cover feel like one of those clickbait YouTube videos that isn't quite clickbait because it's not wrong, it just isn't noticeable at a surface level. In Crash's PlayStation 1 days, he existed as a 3D platforming Bandicoot who navigated in linear areas, breaking crates and avoiding hazards as they appeared. Generally, this took place in a vertical plane, however it wasn't uncommon where the perspective would shift horizontally. This inspired the entire experience of his Game Boy Advance adventures, as Crash would make his way from start to finish, in a style similar to 4th generation 2D platformers. It even utilizes pre-rendered graphics much like Donkey Kong Country, to give it a bit of a pseudo 3D look. Break the crates, defeat the bosses, unlock special moves. It's exactly what you'd want to see from the Bandicoot on a limited platform like this. Fans of the PlayStation games should be able to notice particular similarities, even down to the environments. The general consensus is this game tried to be a side-scrolling mix between Crash 2 and 3. The first level takes place in a jungle, not at all unlike other Crash games we're familiar with. The second level takes place underwater, where Crash must swim through a stage, similarly to the rest of them. However, in this one, Crash is given full range of the stage rather than being on foot. What remains in the game's lineup of locations are snow levels, sewer levels, sky levels, which much like underwater levels take on a new style of gameplay, and lastly there are the abstract outer space levels. These levels aren't contained in their own worlds, they try to shuffle it up to keep a sense of variety. Unlike Wrath of Cortex, it fits well because the world maps aren't given a distinct theme to make them feel rather misleading once you've, for example, jumped into a jungle map only to find there's snow everywhere. I think these stages were all quite the treat to play, but I guess if there's anything to complain about, it's the snow chase scenes with the giant Yeti. This looks really cool, but doesn't play all that well. It's a bit hard to get a grasp on what's coming up in front of you by the time it's already passed. I've seen worse examples, still this is by no means a great idea, but yeah, it does look pretty awesome, which is probably why they rolled with it. As you first get into the game, you'll probably find Crash doing a few special moves you'd only activate by an accidental combination of buttons. Yeah, there are certain things the game doesn't tell you about. They're things that would be pretty difficult to miss, though I imagine a gamer without any will to experiment might never find out about them. For a good portion of the game, they're not necessary, they just make navigation easier. Somehow as a kid, I managed to figure these things out, so I can't say this is much worth complaining about. It's a tad bizarre, but after all, these were still the days of leaving some context to the manual. Back when I first played Huge Adventure, I only had a loose cart. That's usually how these things were being sold secondhand. Despite knowing the game's special moves, you'll probably find yourself a bit puzzled at times, but intentionally by design. There are certain areas of the game that require more keen observation of the environment to properly navigate. Usually, this is more related to 100%ing the game. In Crash Bandicoot, the idea is to break all the crates in a stage to get a gem. In Huge Adventure's case, you can't even defeat the final boss without completing a majority of it. So ideally, the player should be trying to fully complete a stage even the first time through. This makes the painful moment when you've doomed your chance to break a certain crate all the more disappointing. It's a part of the fun though, as you'll now know to be more observant and not just cause all kinds of havoc willy-nilly. In fact, sometimes you'll have to take things a bit slow. I know there's multiple instances in the game where a checkpoint will start the player slightly elevated into the air, and this screwed me over a couple of times as I generally try to use my power slide to get past repeat segments. Seeing as how I'd start in the air, the button to activate the slide would just put me into a crouching stance, since I wasn't getting a true running start. So yeah, that's a bit awkward. Not a big deal at all, I can afford to lose a few lives, and so can you. The game is filled to the brim with one-ups. Crash the Huge Adventure is a game that I've always had trouble putting into words beyond describing what it is and how it accomplishes these things. I can't find much of anything to say that it did wrong. It's a very safe game that checks all the boxes in what it had to do, although I suppose it can be admitted that the base experience is very short. To get to the game's credits before 100%ing it, you'll only be spending roughly 2 hours. This is a game that begs to be completed, and I don't see that as a bad thing for this one. The levels are very revisitable. Finding a new location you didn't spot before? It's fun. Maybe you now have a special move that makes getting somewhere specific easier, or simply a possibility now. I remember completing this game when I was much younger, and I had a lot of fun doing so. These days I'm a bit pressed for time, but I will vouch for this being a fun game to complete. No nostalgia goggles here, this is an extremely solid 2D platformer. And you know, I actually feel Crash lends itself better to 2D design than 3D. I do have to stop and ponder whether or not that's nostalgia speaking. After all, this was my first Crash game. Can't deny though, Huge Adventure has more developed puzzles than the classic PlayStation 1 games ever did, in my opinion. That's a whole argument in itself, and I won't bother to extend it, because for all I know, that's subjective. Nonetheless, the Huge Adventure makes for a short but sweet experience. Kinda like this video, perhaps? If you liked it, feel free to subscribe for more content like this in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you Frame Raiders in the next video.